the second part of session 3, following up a little bit on what I did the last time. So one of the things we have to look at is how can, from within our own experience, we learn to make distinctions. And we have two great philosophers, one St. Edith Stein, Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, and the other Karol Wojtyła, Venerable John Paul II, who've written a lot on this, using principles from a field of philosophy called phenomenology. And what that does is it looks at our experience from within, but in such a way that we can pick out the essential characteristics of it. And that way we all can share the same essential characteristics, even though each one of us has a unique experience. So the first one is, how can we learn to distinguish sense stimuli from spiritual realities? The difference of them. And we know that St. Ignatius of Loyola began to do this in a certain way when he was sick in bed with his leg bombed by a cannonball, and he was reading, on the one hand, novels, which he loved, and then he read some spiritual books. And he started to observe his experience, and he said, I noticed a difference. Both the novels and the spiritual books give me great pleasure at the beginning, but the novels, the sort of uplifting experience doesn't last. It just fades away. Whereas he said, feeling empty afterwards. Whereas the spiritual pleasure that he experienced in reading great spiritual books remained filling him with joy. So he's the first one that we know of to actually start looking at how we can distinguish from inside our experience. St. Edith Stein decided in her writing to try to describe the difference between the experience of feverishness and vigor. Now, she was a psychologist at this point. This was early in her writing, before she became a Catholic, studying psychology in university. And she was looking at the effects of stimulation of drugs and things like that on people. And here's what she does. She says, feverishness comes on with high stimulation and is like a restless geyser that drives the current of experiencing onward. We want more and more of it. Then she says it's followed by exhaustion. And it actually isn't any beneficial relaxation. And something of restlessness comes into it that cannot come to repose. So these were her studying people who had experience of drugs and stimulation, or high kind of stimulation that way. Vigor, on the other hand, she says, is like a steady flowing fountain from which strong, serene waves of experience are billowing. And when it is played for a while in the flow of experience, goes over into a wholesome tiredness that allows the current to slacken and shut itself off against external influences. Now, she used to go mountain climbing and with her friends and hiking into the hills with her book of Spinoza at that time and other things outdoors. And she was a very active young woman. So this was just two different ways of looking at it. What is the experience like in itself, and what's the effect? She then goes back to feverishness. She says feverishness from a high sense stimulation has a further effect. Impressions do not simply glide off. They don't remain flat as they do with tiredness, nor are they picked up effortlessly and joyfully. Rather, they barge into the defenseless consciousness and hurt it. Now, this is because during experiences of feverish stimulation of the senses, she says the ego slackens, as with all weariness, and is incapable of shutting itself off against the impressions. And so it remains afflicted with an insipid aftertaste. So it's, again, a very interesting part of her own reflections on the two different ways of finding relaxation. One of them might be like, if you're talking about sense stimulation, where you go to a rock concert, a band concert, or there's a lot of music noise. Now, she wouldn't have in her days, but something similar to that, where you have a large amount of simulation of sound, sight. And the other might be, as I said, more the vigor of just spending a day hiking or walking with your community in the mountains. You're exhausted afterwards, where you see many beautiful things, you may hear the birds or whatever, but it has a very different experience afterwards. So those are two things then, between vigor, the recreation, which it invigorates you, but where you're tired and you go to rest really afterwards, or this feverishness where you end up just still being agitated and unable to really feel rested. The next one, Karol Wojtyła himself looks at the difference between excitement on the one hand and elation. Elation being a spiritual experience. So they're using different words, but they're very similar in what they're trying to get at. Now, you may not know this, but Karol Wojtyła's professor, Roman Ingarden, was a classmate and good friend of St. Edith Stein's. And so he was his professor in Poland. So he's a generation after her, all right? So he knew about her work through him. So there's all sorts of correspondence. She corresponded with Ingarden. There are just, I think, well over 100 letters of where they wrote to each other when they were just graduate students together. So in any event, he's doing the similar kind of thing. He said excitement occurs when vivid images happen in the person, and they remain indicative of the sphere of sensuous stimuli or stimulations. So anything that would excite you could be good, it could be bad. In the sense that, I mean, a bad excitement, it was 9/11, for example. Something good could be the Holy Father just, came to Denver and you were at World Youth Day, okay? They're both situations where there's excitement involved. Now, he says elation occurs, however, when the person acts in discovering truth with the intellect or encounters the Spirit in prayer or performing an act of charity. There's still an elevation, but it's different. So I wanted to give you a couple of examples. One of them is actually one our seminarians talked about, is if you think of participating in a really beautiful public liturgy when one of the Holy Fathers comes to the United States, and the whole experience just elevates you. The singing, the prayer, the seeing him, hearing the homily, reading, everything about it. However, what the seminarians' experience was, before one of these meetings, there were rock bands, hugely loud, trying to work up the crowd is the way they felt it. And they were really upset by it. It's interesting. They just came back talking about it. It was so unpleasant. And whatever it was, there was a difference that they felt between excitement and elation. And the fact that it made them tired because they wanted to block out the sound and the noise, the loudspeakers and so on. Now, on a more mundane level, as I talked about before, video games can create excitement. These constant repetitions of the same kind of things. And it can block the pathway in you to genuine elevation. So the example I gave was a seminarian who discovered that as he was playing video games for a break in the afternoon before Holy Hour, it kind of almost ruined his Holy Hour until he finally realized what it was, that he had to stop. Now, there's another category that Karol Wojtyła talks about, which is called the emotionalization of consciousness. And this is something that happens to all of us at different times. And there's nothing wrong with it, per se. For example, the experience of grief is a very obvious one, where someone you love dies. And you feel grief very intensely. What happens in the emotionalization of consciousness is that the emotion extends what Edith Stein would call it into 4 directions, into the depth of your consciousness, into by the intensity of it, it implodes within you. By the duration, it just doesn't seem to go away. And by we would say the breadth and the depth. So the breadth means it fills up all your thinking and your thought. The depth means it hits you deep inside yourself. It's not on the surface. So if you think of the emotionalization of consciousness occurring when something happens in you that overwhelms your ability to think. We've all had these experiences. The way Karol Wojtyła describes it is that in this case, there's a breakdown of self-knowledge in the moment of the experience because of its intensity and how it fills you up. Consciousness loses its objective attitude towards and its ability to control its emotions. You'll have people, they may speak to you, that they feel like they're going crazy or losing their mind because of the emotions are so strong. That's the experience they have. So what he says is when self-knowledge ceases to have its proper activity, the person's ego is no longer the true pivot of experience. So our ego, meaning our conscious ability to look at ourselves and make choices, needs to be the pivot of what we're doing when we're making choices. So Edith Stein talks about it, and Carol Wojtyła too, and how it is then that we have to think now in relation to the media. If we go back to 9/11, for example, those of you that watched the media afterwards remember over and over and over again those pictures of the buildings going down, people jumping to their death out of them, over and over and over. They still come up. Columbine, a very similar thing here. It was so close to us, several of us went over to help. The radio, everything was filled with it. And so what happens then is if you're going through your own grief response, which usually we do in a situation like that, it intensifies it, and it's like the old billows with the fireplace, you know. It inflames it. And so I gave an example. Our local superior here, Sister Mary Judith, when the Columbine thing happened, she said to me at one point, you know, I think you should take a week's break from any media on Columbine. I think it's getting too much for you. And she was right. Of course, I'm going to read the next thing. I thought, oh my gosh, a whole week without finding out, you know, if anyone else is going to die or stories about the brave people. You know what I mean? You just get so involved in these stories. So I stopped for the week, and sure enough, she was right. Things settled down. I could get back to doing what I needed to do for my vocation. But it's like a common experience we have. And this is where, of course, in the community, we'll talk about that tomorrow, the community, how we can help each other. But that's where a friend can tell you, you know, you're too involved in this. But better than that would be if we could see it ourselves and actually make those decisions to pull back a bit from anything that inflames it, let it settle down, take it to prayer, and so on. So actually, Carol Wojtyła even goes further. If we don't do it, let's just say we keep inflaming it, and the temptation is to keep seeking more information about it somehow, or seeing things, or reading things, hearing things. But he says that if unimpeded, the emotionalization of consciousness, and if it's allowed to continue, he says the proper actualization of the person and his or her vocation can be seriously impeded. Because you just aren't working on all your cylinders is basically what happens. It can block our development of full self-governance and so on, and our ability to be available for self-gift in areas where others need us. And what happens is our needs start taking over and dominating our choices. All right, so that's the first part, is some examples of how we can grow in self-knowledge. The next thing, which is really connected to this, is what I call the mediation and lack of mediation in religious life with respect to the electronic or new media. Most of the kind of communications we receive in religious life is mediated through another sister. Someone answers the phone and tells us we have a call. Maybe the superior picks up the mail and distributes it. Someone knocks on the door. Another sister opens the door. Whereas in the electronic media situation, it's just us and the computer. There's no mediator. And so what this does is it creates a situation where we are immediately available to others outside of community by email, internet, cell phone, depending on whatever our assignment is. And sometimes, a lot of sisters, most of us, have spent a lot of time in early formation, postulancy, novitiate, bishop, and even first vows, making a break with our past life, for example, our family, our friends we went to high school with, all these kind of things, people we went to university with, if that's the case. And all of a sudden, with Google, and you get these emails from people, phone calls, your family's put you on a list with, we knew one sister, their family found her email by Googling, just finding out, even though we hadn't given it, she hadn't given it to them. So there you are, your family's calling, or your friends, your good friends, and almost always there's something really urgent, a serious family crisis, somebody's very sick. And before you know it, you're not only just praying, but and you're put on a whole list of emails where they send it to 50 people, and it's very hard to backpedal. It's very hard to backpedal. So this is a common experience that has to be looked at within each religious community, depending on what your charism is, what your policy is about those things. In some cases, I think one could say truly that a sister becomes very vulnerable all over again to excessive demands for her response from persons outside of her religious life, either or her apostolic work. Although I know school teachers have a big